Welcome to the Explorers Podcast with Ken Bowen. Here, Ken connects with friends and peers to discuss issues in the world and practices to improve one's biblical perspective.
This is Ken Bowen. Welcome to Explorers Podcast. I'm here with my dear friend James Taylor, who's the philosophy department with the philosophy department at Westmont College, and you're chairman of that department. And Jim and I have enjoyed such a rich relationship over the last several years, where we've gone back and forth. And that book idea of ours is still not a dead one at all. I still want to pursue some of the things we were talking about, the various acts and so forth. But thank you for joining me with this.
Oh, it's good to be here, Ken. And I've so enjoyed our conversations over the years. And even though we've hardly met each other in person or been together in person, we've had all kinds of phone and Zoom conversations that have been rich experiences.
They have really been. It's been a great experience, and we only met, I think, personally, on two occasions. I think.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's amazing that we've done that. But it's one of those things when you can tell that there's a chemistry that's going to. This is a life friendship, but this is not just going to be something that comes and goes, as most do. But you were invited to make a contribution to leadership in the liberal arts and education to last a lifetime. And you added a chapter to this: grammar, logic, rhetoric, and ethics, the verbal arts and the greater good. And I would be very interested in exploring and letting you walk me through. And I have some questions for you as well, but I marked your paper, and I felt it was very, very helpful to provide an overview of the valuable knowledge, skills, and virtues as agents of positive change that really relate to being people who are lifelong learners, the idea of critical thinking. And you and I have chatted a lot about this idea of the intellectual virtues. And so intellectually virtuous people are lovers of the truth and lovers of wisdom. So why don't you kind of walk us through some of your key thoughts on that?
Sure. Thank you, Ken. So I start by saying that really what I want to try to show in the chapter is that a Christian liberal arts education of the sort you would get at Westmont, where I teach, provides an opportunity for students to acquire the skills, virtues, and knowledge that will put them in a good position after they graduate to be able to make positive contributions to the world. And but I start with the trivium, the verbal or language arts, grammar, and logic and rhetoric, since that's really at the foundation of the traditional liberal arts approach to education, along with the quadrivium, the mathematical arts.
Yes.
So I talk about those initially as kind of the fundamental skills and how they build on each other, starting with grammar, learning how to use language well for meaningful language production and comprehension, and then building on that, learning to reason well with language and logic, argumentation. But more than that, rhetoric, the ability to use language well and reason well in ways that will be persuasive and convincing to people.
Yes.
So those are the language arts, the verbal skills. But I go on from there and argue that skill is not enough. You also need virtue. That,
yes.
For instance, you can be a highly skilled person intellectually in terms of, let's say, critical thinking or having a good memory, and yet not care very much about knowledge and the truth, or maybe be lazy or careless. So the virtue comes in when it's not just a matter of capacity or skill, but really motivation and desire, where you love the truth, and in such a way as to put the pursuit of truth ahead of other interests and concerns, and really ultimately not just any truth, any knowledge, but wisdom. The pursuit of wisdom is really what intellectual virtue is, I think, mostly about.
Yes.
Go ahead. And then just how that the skills and the virtues can contribute, and the knowledge you're acquiring as well. So it's about formation and information. that you're getting the resources then through this Christian liberal arts education to engage in civil discourse of the sort that we desperately need in our polarized and conflicted society.
And there's no question about these intellectual virtues or things that we've talked about, you and I, before, and we had talked about two books in particular. Remember Virtuous Minds by Philip Dow?
Yes.
And he listed 7 of those virtues, and then the Robert Roberts and Jay Wood's intellectual virtues. And it's fascinating that both of them came up with these 7 qualities. They're not exactly the same, but there's a lot of overlap. One of them listed them as intellectual courage and carefulness, tenacity, fair-mindedness, curiosity, and honesty. That was the Dow version book. And then the other one, love of knowledge, firmness, courage and caution, humility, autonomy, generosity, and practical wisdom. But there's an awful lot of similarity, isn't there, in those? There
is, yeah. And I think sometimes they might use different language for the same virtues. For instance, what Dow calls curiosity, maybe that's what Roberts and Wood would call just love of knowledge, love of truth, love of wisdom. But I think they both agree, in spite of specific differences, that virtues, intellectual virtues, involve both a kind of ability or capacity, but also a desire and a motivation. And the ability can be summed up, I think, in general terms, in terms of practical wisdom, and the motivation, love of knowledge. And if you put those things together, then you've got someone who not only cares a lot about the truth, but is able to get it.
Yes. They comprehend, they understand that the nature of that truth, and so these virtues then provide a grasp, a depth, a capacity to see what others might not see. Because if I'm not being willing to be corrected or to hear another point of view or those kinds of qualities, then I'm going to be missing out on a great deal.
Yeah, if I care more about belonging to my tribe and making sure that I think the way they do and don't make any of them angry with me for taking a different position. If I care more about that than I do about the truth, then I'm less likely to get to the truth.
That's right.
That's why courage is needed in addition
to courage. Yes, that's right. Fair-mindedness and courage, humility, ability to hear another point of view, but curiosity and openness. But as you say, courage and conviction and a clarity, a rigor that's also involved, so that you don't compromise, I suppose.
Yeah, and when you think about it, you realize that a good education of a higher sort, a liberal arts education, it's not just about content, not just about information or acquiring knowledge of a propositional sort, but really learning how to think, learning how to inquire well. Becoming a good pursuer of knowledge, and that's where the virtues enter in.
That's correct. As you put it, humility, this idea of one of the critical things of the loving knowledge of the most important truths, humility to admit one doesn't have all the answers, open-mindedness and fair-mindedness to consider the viewpoints of those with whom one disagrees, charity to put those viewpoints in the best possible light, courage to hold firmly to one's convictions or to change them depending on where the evidence leads. And that's exactly what you were just describing. Even if doing so makes one unpopular with the members of one's tribe and so forth. And I think that's a very helpful analysis of that. And earlier you were talking about logos, ethos, and pathos as well. The whole realm of logic and of the passions that we have as well.
Yeah, and I was talking about those in connection with the language art of rhetoric, or the art of persuasion, or
right.
Being able to convince someone to think or do something that you want them to think or do, or that you think it would be good for them to think or do. And it's more than a matter of communicating well by using language well. It's more than a matter even of reasoning well, giving good arguments. It involves communicating to your audience in such a way as to assure them that you have the competence and character um, to be someone who is able to get to have the truth and who wouldn't be deceiving them, but also that you know your subject matter well,
Yes.
and that you know them well enough to know that there are ways in which you need to reach them that go beyond logic and argumentation, that involve how they feel about the subject matter. So you can appeal to their imagination, to their emotions.
Yes,
All of that goes into persuasion.
Yes. So all of that is really a human touch, and it's the whole idea of the personification of the ideation, so that the word becomes flesh. And there's an incarnational dynamic in which the word is infused in us and through us, but through the prism of our personality in such a way that we become, we are more or less manifestations of what we preach, of what we claim. And that's to me a very important idea of becoming that kind of a person.
Oh, definitely. And so just understanding, knowing your audience in such ways to know how best to get through to them, to be persuasive with them. But that's not even enough itself, because one can engage in such a process as the ancient sophists did in controlling and manipulative ways that don't involve proper respect for the audience.
That's correct.
And so it's important to add to that, your rhetoric, not just the intellectual virtues that help you pursue knowledge, but also moral virtues that involve loving your neighbor and respecting them, seeing them as a fellow creature made in God's image.
Yes, you're being winsome, and you're inspiring people's imagination, but becoming a part of that to which they should aspire. I found this wonderful statement by my friend Crawford Loritz to be compelling. Here's what he said about leadership. Leadership is about becoming a portrait of the destination.
Huh. There you go. I love that.
Isn't that an insightful way to put it?
That's wonderful.
Becoming a portrait of the destination, and to which you were just describing in your own thought, this whole process of becoming in your practice what you're claiming in your presentation, so that they see that there's an appeal to this, not just civility, and respect and courtesy and attentiveness, but also a winsomeness, an appeal, and we're more about what we love, and not just about what we are against.
Very good, yeah, and drawing other people through our loves to something that's worthy of all of our love.
Yes,
and having the ability as a leader to not just cast a vision that can be inspiring, but also to embody it, as you were just saying, to
that's correct. Yes,
be living it out in some sense.
Yes, there's an authenticity that's so needed in our time. It seems to me that when I process this whole matter of the cultural dilemma in which we find ourselves, there's a fundamental need for a certain kind of a beauty that is manifested in our time, of beauty, narrative, and authenticity. And by that I mean that in an age of a growing uglification of everything, I think that Peggy Noonan article that I may have shared with you there, everything becomes uglier than it was before. It just even evil isn't portrayed in a creative way anymore. It's just downright ugly. But the nature of it is the three needs of our time. So something that's beautiful, something that inspires people to have a richer narrative, a story-driven amplification of imagination, and then as well on authenticity. And I think that's the area of goodness that that we're talking about here. A sense of being authentic, that you are what you preach. You are the message, and the messenger are becoming more and more consistent.
So the communicator is both, in a way, beautiful in virtue of winsomeness,
yes,
but also true in virtue of authenticity.
That's good.
Or good and true.
Yes.
And that those are important qualities and traits especially when you're engaged in important conversations about things that matter for our life together with people with whom you don't agree. And this
Yes.
could be, of course, non-Christians, or even fellow Christians who with whom you might have fundamental
Yes.
disagreements about values, and in particular, let's say, political values
Yes.
today is especially relevant. But I do talk in the latter part of the chapter about using all these skills, virtues, and knowledge in a common cause
Yes.
with people. And I love what Augustine has to say about that sort of thing in the City of God, when he talks about how members of the City of God, that is, people who love God more than anything else, more than themselves, and members of the City of Man who love themselves more than God. So they have different ultimate loves, but what they can share is a love of earthly peace. And that is, what's happening in this world. We can agree
Yes.
together on things that we need for relative peace and justice. And because we can have that sort of agreement and that shared love, that can be a common basis on which to work together in spite of our ultimate differences.
Yeah, that's right. So that you have the common good, and as you call it, moral virtue, the common good, and the glory of God as a header. And I think those are three components you just described beautifully. The idea that there is a virtue driven understanding, that there is a goodness, there's a fundamental goodness that is other centered, and that you really do care about what I think. You're not just trying to play a game of intellectual chess with me, or you're not
Right.
trying to win an argument, but rather you really are taking into account some of the things you're saying. And so I can, and both of us then give and take, because no one can be 100% wrong. It's as hard. It's as hard to get a 0 on a 100 question true false test as it is to get 100.
Yeah.
And so,
And yeah.
so
And, I think that the Christian part of the Christian liberal arts is especially important here, insofar as we're provided in Scripture and God's Word with a basis on which to uh, uh, prioritize respect for other people, and in the doctrine of our being made in God's image. So we have a basis. And we also, of course, through God's Word and Spirit, have the resources to provide guidance and power to become the kind of people who are capable of loving each other with that kind of respect.
that's correct. And that's what is often has in the past has been called dialogical apologetics as well, insofar as you hear another person and you're actually asking them questions that you really want to understand what they think. And you're, instead of interrupting them, you're really listening so well that that prompts new questions that evokes. And in the process, it's kind of a heuristic tool whereby you can actually help a person unpack more than they might have been able to do if they didn't have a sounding board. And you and I, for example, are good for each other because we're sounding boards.
Yeah.
So you will force me to think in a way I wouldn't have thought by myself, and I hope vice versa. But
Oh, yeah, definitely.
and so and I know you've done this, Jim, where this whole idea of dialogical apologetics, where you, instead of asking, giving answers, you're asking questions, and then each question then reveals another question that you ask your friend, and not in a adversarial way, but actually in a desire to birth something, an
Yeah.
insight from them.
So it's very much of a Socratic approach to Christian apologetics. Using questions as a means by which to draw out what's in the person already, as Socrates did. He thought of himself as being like a midwife. What is the word, maieutic?
Maieutic method, yes, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. You're giving birth, you're a midwife, so you're a spiritual obstetrician.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, that the baby that's birthed by the other person is theirs, so they have to own that thing, whether it's ugly or not.
Yeah. And, sometimes what they might discover by means of that ongoing questioning is that what they're thinking and valuing may not be worth thinking and valuing. But if they can come to that conclusion themselves,
That's right.
then they're more likely to revise how they think about things, so rather than to feel as if they're being manipulated.
That's exactly so. Because what you were doing is listening so well that you're now asking new questions they didn't think about asking, but you're really interested in how they express themselves, and then listening to another, and each one pulls it out where it forces them or guides them into the process in that meiotic birth canal.
You're just helping them to realize the implications or entailments of their convictions
Yes.
and values in such ways for them to see how it all, where it leads. And then they can
Yes.
decide for themselves whether or not they like
Whether
the outcome.
Exactly so. And I've had some strange experiences with that. And I may have shared you this one time when I was in let's see, which of the state parks it was in South Africa. And it was an extraordinary experience where we were doing a photo safari, and I was out there with this person, and he was from South Africa himself, and he was a philosopher. And we were out there, and there were about 30 people who were sitting outside in the bush, and just the game was way below us. And so we were in this beautiful facility that they had, but outdoors. And so I happened to sit next to this fellow. You never knew who you'd sit next to. And we began to spark a conversation, and I found out he was for 10 years he was working on cosmogony, and the whole idea of the origin of the whole idea of the origin of the universe, but theories about the origin of the universe. And when I expressed an interest, because it's probably a turnoff in most conversations, but
you couldn't believe it that you were interested.
Yeah, that I was interested. And I said, tell me more about that. And so, I had a background in that area a little bit. So as I asked him a question, then he was getting more animated. And so I would I'm not arguing with him. I'm really helping him process, and I'm a sounding board for him. And he loved it. And one thing led to another. And what was happening is each time I asked him a new question, it would bring him closer to an insight that he perhaps hadn't seen before.
Mm.
And then that insight, I would probe there gently and see, what do you think about this, if this is so? And guess what happened? What happened after it was must have been 2 hours, because suddenly we looked up and no one was around us. There were like 30 people all having dinner together. But
and you hadn't noticed everybody was leaving.
We didn't even notice. We were that intense. And then I realized, but it got to the point where he had argued himself into a corner. Where he saw that by asking them these questions, it forced him to realize he hadn't thought it through as far as he might have wanted. And then I had this most bizarre experience, and I don't know what you'd call this. It was all these things that you've mentioned before, all thrown into one, whereas logos, ethos, and pathos all emerged in the same telling moment. And in that experience, I asked him this question. I said, "It's Jesus, isn't it?"
Oh, wow.
And he knew that I knew that he knew that it was true.
Wow, that's awesome. That's wonderful.
It passed between us, and we. Now, the next day he still believed it, but then 2 days later he didn't want to talk with me anymore.
Well, yeah, he
a man realized... convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, and so.
Yeah. Well, and there's a seed there that's been planted, and
precisely. And the next day, exactly, I gave him a copy of Hamlet to Prayer, and maybe he never cracked it open, but. I'd like to think as we met, that was not that was providential, and that another person would have picked up from there. You never know in God's good economy. So I pray for him when he comes to mind.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a great story.
Isn't that a fun thought?
Good example of that sort of approach.
Yes.
The Socratic apologetics.
Yeah, myotic, Socratic. You're pulling it out of them. But what the key to that thing seems to me to be other-centered. Rather than show him how much I know, I honestly want to know what he's thinking.
Yeah.
And
so just to have that intellectual virtue of curiosity is so key.
It is so critical. Yeah. Curiosity.
It's a way of loving somebody.
and the love and so it's tempered with love and other centeredness and caring about the person's best interests. So all these elements come in the beauty, the goodness, the truth, and the goodness all kind of converge together in a united whole.
Yeah, and you would hope that if that's your approach to people,
Yes,
people who with maybe especially people with whom you have significant differences, that when your task is to work with that person or those people to solve common problems, when we have fundamental disagreements, that that kind of winsomeness and genuineness and authenticity that shows the person that you care about them and respect them, that it would build a bridge and it would make them more open to working with you, even when they have fundamental disagreements with you.
I think that is really so. That's really how I see it, where you don't have to agree for you to love one another, for you to care for one another, and so forth, but for you to be other-centered and to see. You go into their world to bring them into yours, but you're also willing to be able to revisit and rethink without fear of counter conversion. I mean, I think the more I study the faith, the more confident I am of its unique capacity for clarity. It's the clarity, coherence, consistency, and the comprehensiveness of all the biblical worldview. There's nothing like it. But what I love about it is we can go into their world and learn from their world.
Yeah, and then the virtue of fair-mindedness, being open to someone's alternative point of view that conflicts with yours. There are degrees of openness, of course, and at a certain point, I think it's reasonable. You can be open-minded, fair-minded, without being inclined or disposed to agree with them.
That's correct.
Or
Yeah.
you don't, to be open-minded, you don't have to set all of your fundamental convictions aside and have
Right.
and leave them up for grabs.
That's correct. Yes, you can hear and learn from them, but you still have a clarity of vision, and because this is it is through this that we see everything else, as Lewis put it.
Yeah, and so there can be a kind of firmness that is balanced with the openness and charity.
Yeah, that's a good way of seeing it. There's a kind of reciprocity and a give and a take, and a kind of a both-handedness, but without compromising the actual fundamental nature of truth itself and beauty and goodness. They're not wobbly and culturally up for grabs, as we know. This has been fun to be with you, my friend.
Yeah.
And I love how you then conclude that attending a Christian liberal arts college or university can add value to a person's life, and that virtue of the nature of this added value, students who graduate from such institutions can be equipped to make worthwhile contributions to society. And that's really a lot of what you've been. I bet you have some pleasure from time to time to think about all the hundreds and hundreds of students whose lives you've touched by helping them think more clearly, write more rigorously, and relate more effectively.
It is very satisfying, and I love when I occasionally hear from students with words of appreciation.
Yeah.
And then just yesterday, I met with a small group at the college in a committee in which we're coming up with decisions about alumni awards, and to look at the people who have been nominated and how they've taken advantage of their Westmont education. In the first place, you got to use the opportunities of learning when you're there.
Yes.
But then the next step is once you're out in the world to continue to use those resources in your work, in your life. And I'm just so pleased and proud of a number of Westmont grads, ones we talked about, for instance, yesterday, and how they have. Again, not just acquired knowledge, but acquired skill and virtue and wisdom that they're using in the world to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to think of a life better lived than the idea of Christ-likeness in in our thought and word and deed, and the interior life manifesting itself in excellence in the exterior practice.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah. Well, as always, it's been fun being with you, and we'll have another one of our chats.
I look forward to it, Ken. Thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you for being a part of the Explorers Podcast. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.